Welcome everyone to the AATRN Topological Complexity Seminar. Our speaker today is Nick Scoville, who will tell us about discrete Morse theory.
Great. Thanks, Dan. Thanks, everyone, for being here. Thanks for the invitation. And I guess I want to thank you all for what I hope will be your patience through this talk. As you can see, this is not really a talk on topological complexity. I did my doctoral work on the Lustenich-Stroman category, and I published it, about 15 years ago, but I haven't really done too much with Lustenich-Stroman category other than some discretization work with it. And I've never actually published in topological complexity. So, Jesus said that you were looking for other topics that were related, but not quite topological complexity. So we won't see any of that today. Of course, people probably know that Lustenich-Stroman category has its origins in critical point theory, and there's some nice relationships between Morse theory and Lustenich-Stroman category, and hopefully this talk will inspire some ideas that we might have for things we can do with discrete Morse theory and topological complexity, discretized versions of it and such. So that said, though, I just want to give a brief introduction to discrete Morse theory, what it is, and then a few research directions, research problems that I've worked on recently with some collaborators. So to get started with this, let's see, good. I'll introduce discrete Morse theory, and then I'll tell you three different, as I said, research directions that I've gone using discrete Morse theory. So basically, the way I like to introduce discrete Morse theory is the following. Applied topology, topological data analysis. This is very big and exciting these days. So suppose you have a collection of data points in some metric space, and I'm interested in building some sort of simplicial complex out of these data points, trying to do persistence or something like this. So I might build a RIPS complex on this. And if I'm building this RIPS complex, I'm going to get some sort of simplicial complex at every stage. And of course, what I'm interested in is the topology of this simplicial complex. Presumably, the homology or the homotopy type is going to tell me something interesting about my data, and I'd like to compute something like this. So the first thing that I want to point out is I'd like to be able to simplify this simplicial complex without losing any pertinent topological information. So I'm going to take a look at the dark green edge and the light green face up in the top right-hand corner. It's not too difficult to see that if I were to remove these, I would maintain the topology of this simplicial complex. One way to think about this is I can kind of deformation retract this edge and this face into its boundary, and that's going to preserve the homotopy type. This phenomenon is known as a free pair. When I have a pair of simplices that differ in one dimension, such that the lower dimensional simplex is a face of the higher one, and the lower dimensional simplex bounds no other faces, I'm going to call that a free pair. And the idea is that I can remove a free pair. I can kind of pluck this off without ever changing the topology, the homotopy type, and consequently the Betti numbers of this simplicial complex. So I'll just kind of dissolve that, pull that off. It's a very combinatorial move. And what I'm going to be interested in is trying to take this idea as far as I can go. Very simple combinatorial move, pulling off these free pairs. There's another free pair right there, and I will pluck this off as well. Now we've opened up this edge vertex pair, so I can pull off the edge and the vertex as well, pluck that off. The action of removing a free pair is going to be known as an elementary collapse. And so what I want to do now is perform as many of these elementary collapses as possible. So every time I see a free pair, I'll denote it in this green. I'll start plucking it off, going as far as I can, never changing the topology of this. And at this point, I'm stuck. I don't have any more free pairs. It's easy to check that I don't have any more free pairs and can't perform any elementary collapses. So at this point, what I'm going to do is I will take a random top dimensional simplex, uniformly at random, let's say. I'll take that edge, I'll color it in red, and I'm going to rip it out. And I use this language of ripping it out, kind of this violent language, to emphasize the fact that when I do that, now I've definitely changed the homotopy type. I've killed that cycle that was previously there. But in order to take account of that, I'm going to put that edge there in the red. So I will keep note of that. So I ripped out that edge. I'm going to keep track of that in the right-hand side. But now I can continue performing these elementary collapses. So I'll continue removing these free pairs, again, as far as I can go. And once again, when I get stuck, I'll choose a top dimensional face, an edge in this case, uniformly at random, rip it out, keep track of it on the right-hand side, and just keep removing these free pairs. Finally, I'll get to a single vertex. I'm going to want to keep track of that as well, that last piece. And so this action of performing these elementary collapses, along with ripping out these single top dimensional simplices, is summarized in this data up here on the top right, these two edges and this vertex. So this is all well and good. What I'd like to do is try to put a mathematical framework, a mathematical structure to what we just did here. So the idea is going to be that of a discrete vector field. So if we let K be any simplicial complex, I'll define a discrete vector field to be a collection of pairings of these simplices. If you look at this definition here, this is capturing more or less what we did in the previous slide, capturing these edge or these simplices that differ in one dimension. And I'm going to want to have at most one simplex in each pair. I'm going to call points in this vectors or arrows. And for the two simplex here at the bottom of the screen, I have 4 different examples of discrete vector fields that I can put on this 2 simplex. And so the idea is that this will be kind of summarizing the data, the information that we did in the previous slide, or communicating it rather to the reader there. So how will we do this? Well, I just want to give one more definition. That's of a V-path. So this definition, it's not too difficult. It's a little bit cumbersome. I'm including it here just for completeness, but basically the idea is that if you think about the previous slide with all of the different discrete vector fields that we had, they have arrows, and I can think of myself as living on one of the simplices and following the arrows in those directions. And so a V-path is just going to be essentially any path that I'm able to take by starting at a simplex, following the arrows, and stopping wherever I wish. And I'm going to be primarily interested in whether or not I can get back to where I started. This is the idea of a V-path being closed, and we saw one of those in the example in the previous slide. If I think of myself as an ant living on one of the vertices, if I follow the blue arrows, I can get back to where I started. So we'll call this V-path closed. And what I want to do is I would like to not allow these closed V-paths. So I want to define on any simplicial complex a gradient vector field to be one of these discrete vector fields, which is matching these simplices with the property that you don't have any closed V-paths in them. And so what I claim is that what we did a few slides ago on this simplicial complex can be communicated in this language of a gradient vector field. How so? Well, if you think of the 2 simplices that were plucked off together, I can think of that as a matching or a pairing in this gradient vector field. And this gradient vector field will communicate the simplices, the pairs of simplices that we pulled off. So every simplex is either starting from an arrow or ending in the head of an arrow, or if it's not part of an arrow, I'm going to color that in red. These are precisely those simplices that we ripped out. And so we're going to call those simplices critical. And that name is very appropriate because, as we noted last time, when I'm ripping out these things in red, those are somehow changing the topology. And so those are really the things that most matter for our topology. Okay, so this is one way to communicate what we did several slides ago, the idea of a gradient vector field. Every simplex is either in the gradient vector field as one of these arrows, and I can think of that as something that doesn't really matter too much for the topology, although that's not quite true. But for the most part, what really seems to matter are these critical simplices. Okay, well, one thing that you might be wondering about is that when we ripped out these simplices several slides ago, we did this in a certain order. And the order in which we performed these elementary collapses is lost if I only communicate to you the gradient vector field. In some cases, that doesn't really matter. Other cases, I may want to think of the ordering of this. And the way we will take care of that is going to be as follows. So I will replace my arrows with a labeling of the simplices. If you notice in the top right-hand corner, I've replaced the arrow that I had on those two simplices with the numbers 20. I've assigned the number 20 to the edge and 20 to the face that it's bounding. And I'm giving them the same number to communicate that they are a pair, they come together, and no other simplex will have that number 20. So 20, the fact that they both have that same number, indicates that they come as a pair, and 20, it's a high number, and that's going to indicate that it's the first thing that's kind of plucked off. So that means I will label the next thing that's plucked off as 1919. They come in a pair. And then the next thing that we pulled off was the vertex and the edge, 1818. And I will keep going in this way, labeling these values one less than the previous. And what really matters here is going to be the order of the values. I don't care so much about the actual values themselves. I like to use integers, keep them positive, but it doesn't really matter. I can use fractions, transcendentals, negatives, anything like that. But you notice at this point I've stopped because the next thing that we removed was we ripped out this edge that I've now labeled 11. And this is appropriate that 11 gets its own unique value. This indicates the fact that it's critical. So the collapses, the free pairs, well, they come in pairs of numbers. If I have a partner number, that means I'm part of an elementary collapse. And if I have a unique value, a unique number, no, let's see. Whoops. Yeah, let's see. 10, yeah, there we go. 9, 8, 7, 6. Label the critical edge there 5 and label the critical vertex 0. Again, it doesn't matter if you end at 0 or whole numbers or whatever. It seems to be nicer to have the smallest number 0 there. Okay, so this is an example of what essentially is a discrete Morse function on the simplicial complex that's communicating the same information as that gradient vector field, except it's giving me an order in which I'm going to perform my collapses, rip things out. I won't give the technical definition of this, but you've essentially already seen it here in this example, where we have this idea that these free pairs have the same value and critical simplices are given their own unique value. Okay, so I've got a gradient vector field, which another perspective is a discrete Morse function that I can put on there. What can we do with this? Well, if you are familiar with regular Morse theory, one important idea is the concept of these level sets, especially in the standard example that everyone must have by law in any book on Morse theory of the torus. You've got the height function. We have a similar idea here with a discrete Morse function when it's labeled that of the level subcomplex. So you give me any real number, I'm going to define the sub-simplicial complex of K to be all the simplices that have the value less than or equal to that threshold number. So this will allow me to build my simplicial complex from the ground up in stages. We introduced this idea of collapsing and ripping things out from the top-down approach. I can also build it from the bottom up by starting at level 0 and moving from there. So I have that critical vertex here in the top right corner. I begin to build. The topology doesn't change at all. Now I glue in that edge labeled 5. That's critical there. This is my level subcomplex at height 5. And now I'm going to continue to build up level subcomplexes, but the order, or the topology, I should say, will not change until I get to that next critical simplex. And if you think about it, we're really doing the exact same thing we were doing several slides ago, except in reverse. Keep building, keep building. And now I build my simplicial complex from height 0 all the way up to height 20 there. Okay, so I've got gradient vector fields, discrete Morse functions. From there, I can talk about my level subcomplexes, which give me a filtration of the simplicial complex. And now I just want to share a couple of the main theorems of discrete Morse theory. This is all, by the way, due to Robin Foreman from the late 1990s, around 1998. And there's several other really key theorems that I won't share with you here, but I will tell you two of the main ones. If I have a simplicial complex and of dimension k, or sorry, the dimension of k is n, and you give me a gradient vector field, and I can count the number of critical simplices, mi, for each dimension, well, then we have a couple of main theorems that I want to tell you about. First of all, the collapse theorem, which is that if I have a real interval that contains no critical values, then the level subcomplex at height b will collapse down to the level subcomplex at height k. I think we saw that illustrated in both examples that we looked at. And furthermore, we have a structure theorem, which is that K is homotopy equivalent to a CW complex with exactly one cell of dimension P for each critical simplex of dimension P. And if you think back to that first example we did, we found this discrete Morse function on that simplicial complex that had two critical cells in dimension 1 and one cell in dimension 0. And this is very appropriate. I'm essentially gluing, to get the homotopy type of that, I'm gluing two edges onto a vertex by the boundary. Okay, and so if you're familiar with the smooth Morse theory and in the smooth setting, these results are perfectly analogous to some results in that smooth Morse theory. I also should mention that I said I did lie to you just a little bit when I said that the gradient vector field, the arrows on the non-critical simplices don't matter. They do actually tell me how to glue these simplices. So just like in the smooth case, the structure theorem doesn't quite tell me the homotopy type because I need to know how to glue the critical simplices together. And so we run into the same problem. Well, how do you determine the attaching maps or the gluings? And well, you can actually figure this out. It takes quite a bit of work from the gradient vector fields. Okay, but these are the sort of the basic theorems due to Foreman. At this point then, after that very brief introduction, I just want to tell you a little bit about some different projects that I've worked on in discrete Morse theory with some collaborators. First is discrete Morse theory for open simplicial complexes. This is joint work with Kevin Knudson of the University of Florida.
That's a terrible picture of me, Nick. You couldn't have found a better.
Oh, I didn't know you were here, Kevin. Nice to see you. I almost chose your picture from Jeopardy, but I went with this one. I actually really like this one.
It's a good shirt anyway.
Okay. Well, there it is. So yeah, there's Kevin, and he's here. Very good. Glad to have him here. So here's the setting. So let's let X be a simplicial complex, and we'll let T be a subcomplex of this simplicial complex. So I can take any subcomplex that I would like. In this case, the running example that I'm going to use, I've got there in red. And the things that I'm interested in studying and thinking about a discrete Morse theory for are going to be what we're calling open simplicial complexes, which is going to be the simplicial complex removing the closed subcomplex there. So in this case, we've kind of chosen the boundary as an illustration, but you can take any closed subcomplex. And what we would like to do is come up with a discrete Morse theory that is suitable for an object like this. These objects come up fairly naturally in the discrete stratified Morse theory that Kevin and Bei Wang came up with. And so this may have some applications there, but right now I just want to think about what a discrete Morse theory here would look like. So one thing you can try to do is just very naively try to do standard discrete Morse theory on this open simplicial complex. Maybe this works. Maybe Robin Foreman missed something and we really don't need to have this nice boundary and these nice simplices there. Let's just try this. So I can put a gradient vector field on here, just ignoring the fact that I'm missing a bunch of stuff. And I can look at level subcomplexes that are induced by this gradient vector field, or ones that I could put on here. And let's see what happens at each stage, how the topology changes, especially thinking about those structure theorems and the collapse theorem that I mentioned a couple slides ago. So if this is my gradient vector field, here are my critical simplices. I have actually two critical edges here. There's another one down there and a critical face. All right, very good. Let's see what happens here. So if I try to build this in stages by one possible discrete Morse function, well, I'll start with this edge there. Okay, so far so good. Put in a critical edge. I add a new component, and I'm going to start building. Start adding all these things in these arrows. What I want to notice here, what I want to point out, is that it looks like I've completed a cycle, but I actually have not, because I don't have this vertex here. So actually this thing still has not completed a cycle. However, on the very next edition of this edge face pair, I now have completed a cycle. And this might be a little problematic. I've actually completed a cycle, detected new homology by adding a pair that isn't critical. So one drawback of trying to do this very naively is that the topology can change at a regular simplex, or essentially the addition of something that isn't critical. Okay, that doesn't look so good. Let's keep doing things. Well, I've got this new edge, this critical edge that I'm going to bring in, and what again I want to notice is that this is not connected. This new edge is actually its own separate component. And so now I've got the addition of a one simplex, which should normally create a cycle, adding a component. So the addition of a one simplex actually changes the topology in dimension 0, and not by removing something, but adding something. That's weird. All right, let's keep going. Let's let the weirdness continue here. Keep adding these things. I have not actually completed a cycle here, nor have I connected back to this original simplex here. These aren't actually connected. But when I add in this critical 2 simplex, I now see that this addition of this critical 2 simplex does two things simultaneously. It actually creates a cycle, and it kills this previously separated component. So this is all shades of messed up if you try to do this very naively. It seems like there's really no hope here. Things look very bleak if you just try and, again, do this from the naive perspective. But the key here is to look at the order complex of this. There we go. The key is to look at the order complex, Sk of k. The order complex is going to be the simplicial complex, which is induced on by the Hasse diagram, by chains on the Hasse diagram here. So I'll very quickly draw the order complex here, or really it's like the this poset here, but it's got the same structure for one dimensions, in dimension 1. This is going to be this order complex, and the yellow is a bona fide simplicial complex here. So I'm going to associate to K, my open simplicial complex, a bona fide simplicial complex passing to this order complex here. Then what I'll do is I'm going to extend this gradient vector field that we had previously put on here to a gradient vector field on Vx. So I see that are there questions in the chat? I'm not, let's see.
I got it, Nick. Don't worry about it.
Okay. Oh, thank you. So I want to extend, yeah, thank you. Want to extend the gradient vector field that we had previously put on the open simplicial complex to a gradient vector field on the entire simplicial complex by making everything else critical. So I'm going to add that stuff in there. Okay, I can do this. It's going to be very wasteful. I want to have as few critical simplices as possible, but I can do this. So now I do have a bona fide gradient vector field on a bona fide simplicial complex. Then from there, I can find a discrete Morse function on the entire simplicial complex that is compatible with this gradient vector field here. That's not too bad to do. From there, I want to take the barycentric subdivision of this simplicial complex here. So I'm going to draw that in. This is when things will start to look a little bit messy. But there is my barycentric subdivision of the entire simplicial complex. And what I want to point out here is that it's a little difficult to see, but in kind of that forest or dark green, you may be able to see that I've got this order complex of the open simplicial complex living inside of this subdivision. So I'm going to go through, it's like a 7-step process. It's a little bit technical. No step is too difficult. And you can kind of see what's going on here. I've got this order complex living inside of the barycentric subdivision of my entire simplicial complex. And then from there, I want to use, there's this nice result of Zhukova where he extends a, or maybe it's she, I'm sorry, extends a gradient vector field on a simplicial complex to a gradient vector field on the entire barycentric subdivision. And this is essentially what we have. We have a gradient vector field on our order complex, and I'd like to extend that to a gradient vector field on the entire barycentric subdivision. So I want to make sure that I don't introduce any new criticalities and keep everything basically this as similar as possible. So I can do that here. Again, it's very busy down there, but I've extended this gradient vector field that I previously had to a gradient vector field on the entire barycentric subdivision, and it's consistent with the previous gradient vector field that I had before. And now I want to restrict this gradient vector field to look at the induced gradient vector field on this order complex of K. And so if I remove all that extra other stuff, basically the kind of short version of this is that I did all of this stuff to get a nice gradient vector field that is going to be compatible with a larger gradient vector field in some sense. I want to get a nice gradient vector field on this order complex, which again is a bona fide simplicial complex where I can do discrete Morse theory. Really, the question is, and we'll get to this in a few moments, what's the relationship between the discrete Morse theory done on this order complex and the topology of this open simplicial complex? So I have this gradient vector field on my order complex. Then I'm going to extend the gradient vector field on all of the barycentric subdivision to the entire thing. So again, we're adding these arrows, we're extending, we're doing lots of things. We're almost there. I want to make a couple more definitions, and I'll include them just for completeness, but you shouldn't worry too much about them. I can talk about what you would like to be the barycentric subdivision of this open complex, right? There's no such thing as the subdivision of an open complex, but this is essentially what I would like it to be. And then I want to talk about level sets in this quote unquote subdivision of my open complex. And these are going to act in the way that we would kind of hope them to. The short version of all of this is going to be as follows. So all of this can be summarized in the following result, that if I have a interval that doesn't contain any critical values on the entire order complex of SK, right? So this is a bona fide, again, a bona fide simplicial complex. I can do the standard Foreman discrete Morse theory on there. What does that tell me about the way the topology changes on the open complex? So I can study the discrete Morse function on the order complex, and it will tell me something about the topology of this open simplicial complex. Essentially, the height B subcomplex of this open complex K will deformation retract, and so it has the same topology as the level subcomplex of height A. And furthermore, we get this nice structure theorem result that if I go from height A to height B, where I introduce a single critical value, I can realize this by attaching a critical simplex there. And so we get this analogous result to the structure theorem, and an analogous result. I guess here's the analogous result to the structure theorem that we've got here. So I think this is a very nice result. We haven't been able to find necessarily applications of this, but if there are places that you know of or you're aware of where open simplicial complexes do come up and discrete Morse theory methods and tools might be helpful, we do have a nice structure theorem here that will allow us to say some things. So that's what I want to say about open discrete Morse theory done on these open simplicial complexes. Let me move now to a project I work on involving cycles and merge trees with my colleague Julian Brüggemann, who's currently at the Dioscuri Center in Poland. So again, I want to give a very short motivation for merge trees here. Again, I've got a collection of data points that I'd like to say something about. In particular, I want to think about maybe clusters of these data points. And so if I've got these data points in some Euclidean space, I can think about what are the proper clusters. And so from one perspective, under one sort of distance level, maybe I just think about mutual distances here. This might be one clustering of the data for one threshold. But you can imagine if I have a really small threshold, everything is in its own cluster. And if I have a really large threshold, everything might be in a single cluster. And so how do I kind of look at all clusters simultaneously? Well, this is the idea of a merge tree. Essentially, what I can do is I can grow these disks around each point, and I can keep track of the clustering information and the joining of these clusters at every stage kind of continually. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to sort of build this RIPS complex on the top, and I'm going to draw this merge tree at the bottom and see how these different components are merging and which components they are merging to throughout time. And so as I'm getting more and more connections, I'm getting more and more connections downstairs in the merge tree. Everything is a single component. And so now I've got a single component over here at the end. And so the way that this merge tree kind of summarizes what I just saw there is the following. If I take any time slice, which I will show in orange there, let's say all the way to the immediate left, well, this is telling me that every point needs to be in its own cluster. Let me move the time slice in orange, this vertical orange bar at the bottom, a little bit to the right. And I'll stop maybe there. And there, it's telling me that this is the way the clusters should look. I have these different clusters. The example that I showed you at the beginning of this example was for a threshold right there. It's kind of a sensitive place where this cluster just shows up and it's about to be to change a little bit. And as you can see, this vertical line corresponds to 1, 2, 3, 4 clusters. And there's the 1, 2, 3, 4 clusters. And of course, by the time I move this bar all the way to the end, this is telling me that all the data is clustered together in a single giant cluster. So just like persistent homology, where I'm seeing what the homology of this data set looks like over time at all parameters, I'm seeing what clusters look like at all parameters when I'm looking at a merge tree. Okay, so this is something that people are really interested in for all the data that we're studying these days. There is a discrete analog of this, which I will illustrate to you here, that I can put on a simplicial complex. So I can put a discrete Morse function on a simplicial complex, In this case, everything is critical, so this seems a bit wasteful, but this will induce a merge tree, which will tell me the evolution of how the components merge up with one another. So I'm going to try and do a couple things at once here. I'm going to both build the level subcomplexes that this discrete Morse function is telling me, and I'm going to build the merge tree. So this might look a little confusing at first here. So at the bottom, I'm starting to build the level subcomplexes. Draw me everything that's labeled 0 or less. That's just a 0. That's not too exciting. On the right-hand side of the screen, I'm going to simultaneously build my merge tree. And I have a 0 there representing the fact that I have a single component by itself. Okay, so these two things look identical at this point, and they will for a few stages. I'm going to draw my level 0 or level 1 subcomplex. Okay, that's just a 0 and a 1, and I'll add on the right a 1 to correspond to the fact that I have a second disconnected component. And I've placed them in kind of a weird location in space because I have a little bit of foresight about how this merge tree is going to look. My next level subcomplex is at stage 2. Okay, this is not looking very exciting. I can't tell the difference between what I'm doing on the bottom left and on the right. Hopefully this will make a little bit more sense in the next stage when I draw the level 3 subcomplex, which is everything labeled 3 or less. And now on the right, I would like to somehow represent the fact that the two previously disconnected components have merged together. I'm going to do that by representing this edge labeled 3 with a vertex. And so this is telling me that the components represented by vertices 1 and 2 were joined together by edge 3. Okay, let's keep going. Hopefully, as we do this through stages, this will make more sense. I add vertex 4. Now I've got 3 separate components, and that's represented by these 3 separate components here on the right. Now the component represented by 0 and the component represented by 4 are merged together. So they will be merged together there on the right, represented by this vertex 5. Next, what happens is I introduce another component called 6. There's component 6 over there. And in this next stage, the component represented by 6 is merged to the component represented by, well, it's got everything with 0, 4, and 5. At this point, it's represented by 5. And so I'm going to draw this edge there between vertices 5 and 6 to vertex 7. And so I can see that the component represented by 6 was merged not to the stuff with 1, 2, and 3, but to the stuff with 0, 4, and 5. The next thing we have is now both components are merged together. And so that's vertex 8 will represent that merging. And so now we can sort of see the evolution of those different components by taking a look at this merge tree. Of course, we're not done. There's a few other things happening here. I've now got vertex 7, or vertex 9, excuse me, that's its own component. The next thing, though, is we create a cycle, and this is one small thing that Julian and I added to this merge tree phenomenon, which is that I can represent the fact that I've got a cycle now by a node which only has a single child. If you notice this is actually what we're drawing here on the right is actually a binary, well, it's almost a binary merge tree, which is upside down, but the vertex 10 will only have one child node. Again, kind of upside down from the way you normally think about a binary search tree. It only has one child node representing the fact that it's a cycle. So I can read that off from the merge tree. I've got vertex 11 now, which is joined to the previously disconnected component. And the last thing that happens is I create a second cycle. And so all in all, I get the merge tree on the right associated to the discrete Morse function on the left. I can read off the fact that I've got a couple of cycles there, given the fact that I've got 2 vertices with only, these inner vertices with only one child node. I've got these leafs, which are all children, and I can sort of learn some information for how the components merge and evolve over time here with this merge tree. So one of the questions that Julian and I looked at in this problem was that of the realization problem, which functions I can induce, which merge trees I can induce on a given generalized merge tree here. Let me quick check this chat here. Do we make merge trees with graphs or simplicial complexes? Yeah, that's a good question. Right now, it is only with graphs. Julian and I are actually working on something to hopefully generalize this to higher dimensional simplicial complexes and to take into account that other homotopy or homology information. But right now, that's a great question. It is only for all connected graphs, but we are able to do this with cycles as well. So the question is, if I'm given a generalized merge tree, can I realize this as induced by a discrete Morse function on some graph? So suppose I hand you this generalized merge tree, generalized being the fact that it contains at least one cycle node. Can this be induced by some discrete Morse function on a graph? And so let's see here. Let's try and go through this. The way we can kind of think about this is, well, okay, that red vertex will come from some vertex there. I'm going to kind of try to build my graph backwards here. And I see that it was ultimately merged with some other component, which did a lot of stuff before it was merged. And so that component will, first of all, be represented by the blue vertex. So there's that blue vertex there. And what's the journey of this blue vertex's component? Well, another component showed up and it was joined to something there, let's say by this purple edge. And what else happened before? Well, there was another vertex that was added to that component. That's going to be a vertex which I'll draw there in yellow, and it was connected to that component at some point. I'll make that represented by an orange vertex, and so I'll connect them with an orange there. What you can probably see is that if this does exist, it's not going to be a unique graph up to isomorphism. There's certainly a lot of different graphs that it could be, but I just want to see if it exists right now. So I'm just going to make whatever for choices. Now we see that this component, this large component, is going to be merged to the single vertex that's been isolated for a while. That's going to be by a dark blue edge. And so I'll just draw some connection there. Again, it's not a unique choice. What's going to happen next? Well, this teal or light blue vertex corresponds to a cycle. And let's see, do I have enough room here to create a cycle? Yes, I do. There's a few cycles that I could create here. So that corresponds to a cycle. And we finally end with another cycle, which I've got in kind of a light or dark, or lighter gray. And I can support another cycle there. So it's possible, hopefully you believe me, that I could find a discrete Morse function on this Harari graph there on the left that induces this discrete Morse function, or that induces this merge tree there on the right. So in general, how will this work? Let's see here. What would stop me from being able to induce some sort of merge tree there? When would this be a problem? Well, let's try to induce this generalized merge tree and see what would happen here. I think this is a nice illustration of what's happening in the general result. So again, we'll proceed as before. I have to start with some vertex there in the red. It's isolated. And what happens? Immediately, there's a second component there in the dark blue, and they're going to be matched up. So I introduce two components, and then I immediately join them together by this green vertex corresponding to an edge. So they're matched up. Okay, if I move on to this purple vertex, that is a cycle node, or that's representing the fact that I need to now introduce a cycle into the graph. And if I'm doing this for regular CW complexes, where I'm allowed to do things like that, that's no problem. And our theory actually allows that, this idea of cycle nodes and generalized merge trees, you can do that. But one interesting question you can ask is, if I want to restrict myself to live in the world of graphs, when can I do this? And this would require me to have a multi-edge. And let's say that's something we don't want to allow. And so the idea here is that if I'm going to introduce cycle nodes, I need to make sure there's enough vertices and enough and few enough edges. There's not all these edges between all these vertices to support a new cycle. And so I'm going to state our one of the theorems that we're able to show here in kind of an informal way. It's not difficult. I think I can better illustrate this through an example. And there's just a lot of notation to explain this thing in quotes here, if there's enough vertices available to add an edge. So here's what I want to do. Let me give a fairly large generalized merge tree here, and I'd like to see if, according to our theorem, there exists a graph and a discrete Morse function on that graph that induces this generalized merge tree. What do I need to do? This says that I need to check a certain counting condition over every cycle node. So let's see, let me look at my graph here, or my merge tree. Let me grab my some cycle node. The order here doesn't really matter. I just need to grab a cycle node. I've got that there colored in red. And I'm going to look at and count all the vertices that would be in the graph at that point, and all the edges that would be in the graph at that point. And I need to check, am I able to support a cycle in a graph that has 4 vertices and 3 edges? And if you're familiar with graph theory, all we're really doing here is seeing whether or not you have too many edges to create essentially a complete graph on some number of vertices. You may know that if I have a graph on n vertices, the complete graph has n choose 2 edges on it. And so I'm just checking at every cycle node that I have fewer than n choose 2 available edges there. Okay, so if you do the math here, this checks out. Now I need to check it for this vertex. And I assume that this previous thing that was a cycle node, it's now just counted as an edge here. And so I just need to check this combinatorial condition. Do I have a few enough edges to be able to support adding in another edge and creating a cycle? And so I just check if the number of vertices that are blue, choose 2, is less than the number of green, and it is. And I just keep going through the entire graph this way. Again, recounting, check this condition. Okay, check this condition there. It's going to check out. Again, do this for every single cycle node. And okay, blah, blah, blah. You can check this condition, again, just counting the number of green and red. And if you do this, this will work, at least for this particular example, this holds for every single cycle node. So this graph I gave here indeed can be induced by a discrete Morse function. We also have a condition that says when such a graph is planar, which again, if you're familiar with the graph theory, this would not be difficult to actually show, because we're really just using these planarity results from graph theory and just organizing our counting. All right, so the last thing I want to say, hopefully I'll be able to wrap this up in time, is on the complex of discrete Morse functions. And this is a joint work with actually one of my Ursinus students. He was a senior, actually a junior or senior, brilliant student. Now he's a graduate student at the University of Pittsburgh, Connor Donovan, and he's actually responsible for a lot of this work that I'm going to show you. Really, really very brilliant student. So the last thing I want to talk about is the complex of discrete Morse functions on a fixed simplicial complex. As a quick reminder, here is the 2 simplex. And you may remember that we gave this example several slides ago of these discrete vector fields that I can put on here. So these are examples of discrete vector fields that I can put on this 2 simplex. And if you remember, what I really am interested in is these gradient vector fields, these one where I have no closed loops. So this one here in the second from the left, this would be excluded, but here are otherwise 3 examples of gradient vector fields, collections of arrows that I can put on a fixed simplicial complex. So what I'm going to be interested in doing is actually looking at the collection of all gradient vector fields on a fixed simplicial complex. This itself, as we'll see in a moment, forms a simplicial complex and gives me a structure. So I'm going to start by just saying, what if I just want to put a single arrow, a single vector on one of these simplicial complexes? I'm going to call such a vector primitive. This is essentially the building block. And to a primitive gradient vector field, or a single vector, which itself is indeed a gradient vector field. Everything else is critical, so it's not too helpful, but it is a gradient vector field. I'm going to associate a vertex here on the right. I'm going to be looking at gradient vector fields on the left and building something on the right. And so the name of that is CB. It's an arrow that's starting at the vertex C and points towards the edge CB. Well, let's see what are all the primitive gradient vector fields that I can put on this simplicial complex. There's BA, so I will put that there, represent it with a vertex. AAC, that's also represented by a vertex there on the right. And then I get vertices now also for the arrows pointing in the other direction. CCA, AAB, and finally BBC. And so those are all of the gradient vector fields that have a single arrow on them. Now the next question is, of all these single arrow gradient vector fields, which of them are compatible? In other words, if I were to kind of lay the arrows over one another, when would that create a bona fide gradient vector field? Well, let's see. How about if I look at CCA, that's compatible with AAB. There's a gradient vector field with two arrows on it. And so I'm going to represent that there on the right with a single edge between those two. Okay, what else is compatible here? What other pairs? That's compatible, so I'll draw an edge there. These two primitive vector fields are compatible, so I'll draw an edge there as well. And in like manner, I want to look at all possible pairs. When do I have two primitive gradient vector fields that are compatible with one another? When I have those, I'll draw an edge on the right, which correspond to the single arrows. Okay, and so you see I'm starting to build a simplicial complex there on the right. Let's see, do I have any triples of arrows that are compatible? Should I be able to fill in any of these faces? Well, let's see, what might they look like? Something like this, unfortunately, is not a gradient vector field because I have two arrows coming out of a single vertex. Okay, so that's no good. I could look at something like this, but if you remember, this creates a closed loop. And so I could actually allow that and get something which Matt Zaremski and I have studied called this generalized complex of discrete Morse functions. But for now, I don't want to allow that. And so when I do this construction, I'm going to get something that we're going to call the complex of discrete Morse functions to be the simplicial complex of all the gradient vector fields on K. And so this is an object that I'm interested in studying, thinking about, determining homotopy type when possible. And so I'll show you a few of those results that I've come up with Connor. Before that, there's a couple of results that we're building off of. What does this tell me about the simplicial complex? Well, there's this result due to Minion and Capitelli, one of his students, that says that if you look at the complex of discrete Morse functions on two unknown simplicial complexes and they're isomorphic as simplicial complexes, then actually the simplicial complexes they came from are isomorphic. So this is a very beautiful result. A little bit surprising, I would say, that this would be, or maybe not, I'm not sure, but I thought this was a very interesting result that this complex of discrete Morse functions, at least up to isomorphism, it preserves the simplicial structures. Homotopy type, it certainly does not. There's tons of examples where it doesn't, and I'll show you many of them. Okay, so yeah, if for example the complex of discrete Morse functions are contractible, then it does not follow that I can get the same homotopy type or a simple homotopy type on the complexes below. It's a result of Dmitry Kozlov, that the complex of discrete Morse functions for paths and cycles is given by these wedges of spheres here. This was actually done in a different context. This isn't quite the complex of discrete Morse functions that he was thinking about, but this, as you can imagine, this complex of discrete Morse functions is related to things like matching complexes and these other simplicial complexes that one can come up with, associate to a graph here. So I'm going to come back to these results in a little bit, but we know the complex of discrete Morse functions for paths and cycles. And what are a few other things that Connor and I were able to show? Well, let me briefly show you that one of the techniques that we used here, this is the idea of domination. So I'm going to say that an arrow, one of the arrows, like a primitive gradient vector field, let's say, is going to dominate another arrow if every gradient vector field containing V prime is compatible with V. Let me illustrate that with an example here. Here is a perfectly valid simplicial complex here. I'm going to be working with graphs, but this is, you can talk about this for all simplicial complexes. And I claim that the arrow in blue, represented by V, dominates the arrow in red, given by V prime. Again, meaning that anytime you come up with a gradient vector field that has V prime in it, I can definitely overlay V on top of it. So let's look at an example of something with V prime in it. How about this gradient vector field? This has V prime in it. Am I able to overlay V in it? Yes, I am. I can put that on top. And so this will always be the case for any gradient vector field for V prime. As a way to kind of contrast this, I claim that W does not dominate V prime because, okay, I've got that W there in blue. I can put V prime in this gradient vector field. And if I try and overlay W, I get something that is not a gradient vector field. So this is an example of something that doesn't dominate, which I think helps to see what we mean by domination. And yep, that's not allowed. As you may be able to see here, when I have these single leafs, these edges that are by themselves, I get these edges that are pretty close to dominating a lot of stuff there. Very few things are not compatible with it. And in fact, this result, I guess I need to show one other thing before I show this result, which is the following. This is a result due to, again, Barmach and his student, Jonathan Minion. And it wasn't done in quite this language, but I can sort of recast it into this language of this complex of discrete Morse functions, that if I have a arrow that dominates another one, then I actually get something called a strong collapse, which is a sequence of elementary collapses. So this idea of domination is something that's fairly powerful. It's going to allow me to do a lot of collapses and begin to digest a simplicial complex very quickly, pull off a lot of stuff. If you remember all the way back in the first few slides, we were pulling off pairs of things. These strong collapses, when I find these dominating arrows, this allows me to actually pull off a lot all at once, which can aid in simplifying quickly and computations. So I'm almost out of time. Let me show you let me show you this result and just show you a couple other results, and then we should be done here. Suppose I have a simplicial complex that shares, where two leaves share a common vertex, then the complex of discrete Morse functions, this giant thing that contains all of the gradient vector field information, I can actually collapse this to a single point, and I can do it by performing these strong collapses, these, removing many single collapses at once. How does this work? Very briefly, suppose I have two leaves connected to some huge simplicial complex. It could have all kinds, it could be a very high dimensional simplicial complex. But what I can do to collapse this is say, okay, I claim, first of all, that this blue arrow dominates the red arrow. And if you think about this, anytime you've got a gradient vector field, however complicated it might be, that contains the red arrow, I can necessarily overlay the blue arrow, because the only thing that's stopping me from overlaying the blue arrow is if I have an arrow pointing this way, which I cannot because I've got this red one. So this essentially says the blue arrow dominates the red, so I can rip off. Yep, I'm not allowed to do this. This would be the only obstruction. So I can essentially rip off this red arrow. This is no longer an arrow in the complex of discrete Morse functions, which means that this arrow now dominates the entire thing. Any other gradient vector field you can put now on the simplicial complex, because it doesn't include this arrow, necessarily includes this. So essentially now I remove a single arrow, perform a single strong collapse. This now makes my complex of discrete Morse functions a giant cone with this as the cone point, and I can perform strong collapses and collapse this whole thing down. Okay, so let's see, I'm pretty much out of time. There's a few other results that we were able to show. I can compute the, using similar techniques, pulling off these, performing these strong collapses. I can say that the complex of discrete Morse functions on this comb, this kind of extended comb, is always going to be a sphere. And there's some other things there as well. All right, so those are some of the things that I've done with discrete Morse theory. I think it's a very powerful tool. There's all kinds of other things that it can do. I hope there's something in here that might inspire you to think of ways it can be used for topological complexity. And so I want to thank everyone for your attention.
Thank you, Nick. Are there any questions for Nick? You can turn on your audio if you want, so that everybody can hear the question.
Well, Nick, I have a question for you.
Yeah.
So these merge trees really just look like decision trees that you would have in optimization. And years ago, Smale defined topological complexity as the number of decision nodes in a decision tree. And that means, you either have a node that things go in and go right out. He would call that a computational node, or you come in and you have to go one way or the other. And that's the decision node. And so it seems to me that what you have is a notion of topological complexity for these graphs at this point. And so I would like to know what are the characteristics of the graphs that give you merge trees with a certain topological complexity, a certain number of decision nodes, say.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks for pointing that out to me. So I'm not familiar with this Smale's topological complexity here, but this sounds very much like something that is worth investigating, and that actually recovers this notion pretty well, it seems, from what you've said. So I will definitely look into this. Hopefully give you
look in the Lusternik-Schurman book at the end.
Oh, it's there. Okay, great. Thank you. Is this the same when he uses the phrase, but it's not the same topological complexity as Farber's, is it? Or
well, I don't know. Some people claim that Farber was motivated to define his by Smale's definition, but Smale uses sectional category to solve a certain problem, namely approximating the roots of polynomials. And I suppose you could say that since you're using sectional category, that it's the same as topological complexity, but it's a little far apart. I don't know.
Okay, no. Yeah, thank you so much.
It appears that there are a couple of questions in the chat.
Yes, let's see. Can you share what problems we are getting? Oh, one, is it Rabia? Pronouncing that correctly? Asks what problems we're getting in making merge trees of a simplicial complex. Yeah, so one thing that we've done with this is so this paper that Julian and I have is we were able to come up with an algorithm to kind of perform a kind of cancellation of critical simplices. Which is similar to what, if you're familiar with Foreman's discrete Morse theory, he's got a way to cancel critical simplices on any simplicial complex where you have a gradient vector field. But we came up with something for just graphs, which isn't that groundbreaking. It's not terribly that interesting because you can always find a perfect discrete Morse function on a graph. But this algorithm that we came up with, it allows you to do some cancellations, try to keep characteristics of the original discrete Morse function on there as much as possible for a certain meaning of that, if that's something you'd want to do. And it's, as a different question asked earlier, it's kind of inspired us to think about, okay, is there a way that we could extend this to all simplicial complexes and then come up with this algorithm to find new kinds of cancellations for higher dimensional simplicial complexes. And that would be something that's very interesting if we could find ways to cancel critical simplices, which is essentially removing critical simplices for discrete Morse functions on higher dimensional complexes. That's somewhat of a motivation for this. And then let's see, the second section of the graph that you use to build the tree, the label of edges and vertices are random. Oh, they have some rule. Yeah, the rule, thank you. The rule that I gave for that was that of a discrete Morse function, which in this case, no critical simplices. So that means that every simplex has to have a strictly higher value than all the simplices less than it, and then less in dimension than it. So every zero simplex has to have a value strictly less than all the one simplices. All the one simplices have to have a value strictly less than the two simplices. And then within those dimensions, that was essentially random. But it does satisfy some rule.
Any further questions from the audience?
Could I ask one more?
Please.
Nick, so if you have a simplicial complex of dimension n, say, and I remove the K skeleton from it, is that an example of an open simplicial complex? I would think, maybe. And if it is, it's a fact that if you take the simplicial complex, remove the K skeleton, then that complement has the homotopy type of a complex of dimension n minus k minus 1. And I would like to see can discrete Morse theory give me that back by somehow putting a discrete Morse function on, have it on the K simplex, and then seeing what the complement is. I don't know. That's a very vague question, but I would like to understand it that way.
Yeah, I think I see roughly what you're getting at. Remind me, is that a quotient when you remove it?
No, you just take minus the K skeleton.
Okay.
You get rid of it. That's a good question. I'm not. Yeah, I don't. Does a discrete Morse function then descend? Well, it must, right? On the
Yeah,
case.
yeah, that certainly does. But I think maybe what sort of gave you that thought is right. It does give me an open simplicial complex. If I start with a K skeleton of a simplicial complex, or I start with a simplicial complex, I take the K skeleton, that's a closed simplicial complex, and I remove it. I'm looking at something that Kevin and I are studying, an open simplicial complex.
So there's one problem you could look at, maybe. Actually show using discrete Morse theory that you get something of dimension n minus k minus 1 up to homotopy.
Yeah, I think that does sound like something that like a good test case, I think, for that.
That feels right to me, actually. That shouldn't be too hard, Nick. Let's talk about that.
Yeah, that's right. That's a really good. I think that's a great kind of first sanity check.
Okay, good.
You're full of great ideas, John.
None of which I could do.
Yeah.
Okay, should I stop the recording, Dan?
Yeah, sure. Thanks again, Nick.
Thank you.